Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have a very exciting topic for you to close out our 2020 Virtual Collaboration Experience event. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. Our topic for this session is tips for designing eSports venues and training facilities. I'm joined by Michael Brooks. He's the Executive Director for the National Association of Collegiate eSports. Michael,
It's a mouthful.
I know. I really can't think of a better person to speak on this topic. So with that, how about for our audience, we spend some time defining electronic sports, or for short, esports, and what it is.
Yeah. Well, you stole some of my thunder there. Esports, it stands for electronic sports, as you said, right? And I always thought that's a terrible name, but it's kind of decided we're calling it esports, right? It's more accurate to say competitive gaming. It's video games that are being played competitively between highly skilled players, either individually or in a team format. So, think of any traditional sport you want: football, basketball, baseball, soccer, hockey, you name it. Esports is no different, except for the competition isn't occurring in front of you in terms of an analog court or field or arena, but you're playing it online in a digital arena. Um, and that's where the viewership and the action is occurring. So esports, yeah, it's competitive gaming at the end of the day, where it doesn't matter where you are in the world, how old you are, or what your race or gender is, as long as you have the skill, you can compete.
Interesting. Which leads me to the next question. So, that's a great point. I look at my history. I played sports competitively all the way up until college, and I felt fortunate because I had the ability to play certain sports, whereas there were plenty of others that just weren't gifted or you didn't have the skills necessary to play certain sports. So, how do you address that in terms of the demographic or the people that can participate in esports?
Yeah, I mean, so if you think about who is a gamer, and this is partly, so pay attention to this, what is funneling the explosive growth of esports
Hmm.
is it's not one specific demographic that you would label as an esports enthusiast, right? Similar to an
Hmm.
NFL fan, we call them esports enthusiasts, right? They follow a certain game or many type of games
Yes.
at the professional or amateur level. It's basically cutting a swath across all demographics in the United States and further globally. But in particular, it's targeting millennials and younger in a massive way. So what we see with the NFL, with the NBA in particular, is the average age of their fans is unfortunately getting older. So that means that the younger generations are not becoming fans or transferring over that level of interest or love for those sports. So their average
Hmm.
fan is getting older, and unfortunately, if that doesn't change, then you see a decrease in the size of their audience, which means a decrease in everything else.
Hmm.
Esports seems to have come in and basically captured a significant chunk of that. And that might be in relation to cord cutting, shifting of interests, and all that. But you basically see the hard to capture target market millennials having led the way and coalescing in terms of live viewership. That's the important part in esports, whether it be Overwatch or League of Legends or Rocket League or Call of Duty, right? Name the game, but there's an audience there. And that growth led by the millennial generation really is just being kind of exploding actually with the younger generations, right? They're coming in at even
Hmm.
larger ratios. So it's not, like it's not just the kids who couldn't play traditional sports or anything like that. It's literally across the board. And that's why, if you look at the NBA, if you look at the NFL, you have so many of our chief champions in esports are literally the professional athletes in the NBA and the NFL.
Hmm.
There was this is a bit of an aside, but there was a commentator, he had an ESPN show, and he was basically making light of esports, saying it's not a sport. I don't get it. It's for, I think paraphrasing, he said it's for nerds. And he literally had Gordon call in from the Celtics and basically chew him out on live television, saying, "You obviously don't know anything about esports or the NBA because you wouldn't be talking about it, knowing that most of the people in our locker room play League of Legends, the exact game that you're poo-pooing."
Mhm.
And that's his shift. The former president of ESPN, John Skipper, he had to issue a public apology for it, and that's just because the kind of the industry flagstones, right, the people leading in the traditional sense, basically missed a lot of what's happening in esports, and now it's being brought front and center, and they're unsure how to interact with it. But yeah, it's here and it's here to stay and it's growing. You asked for numbers. Nielsen said right now it's 70% of both males and females aged 10 to 20 identify as gamers before any other interest or hobby. So if you look at the youth of the United States, the majority, the super majority of that population is interested in gaming, and esports. What it represents is the very tip of that pyramid, right? You have casual,
Mhm.
you have semi-professional, amateur. That top part, that's where the professional space and the amateur collegiate space lies at is esports, right? It's the super
Mhm.
competitive side.
Mhm. And you said it, but if you look at ESPN, worldwide leader in sports, I listen to them talk about esports. They say that esports isn't really considered sports, or some of them have the belief that a professional athlete or a professional athlete, you can't be that in esports. But the way I look at it, you can be a professional in anything, whether it's sports, esports, whatever industry, you can be a professional in. Uh, Now, with esports, or with the demographic we're talking about, I look at my history, my generation. What's instilled in me growing up was sports. I wasn't aware of virtual sports or esports, but I'd say definitely within the last 5 to 10 years, with platforms like Twitch or what have you, these streaming platforms, it's been brought to the forefront. I mean, you look at what a pandemic has done to sports. Uh, Now esports, I think, has maybe grown even bigger, and not esports in terms of being in an arena, but in terms of people watching people play games. I think that has grown significantly due to the pandemic. So when you just look at esports as an industry in the growth, what are we talking about here? I mean, you look at the NFL, NBA, MLB, some of these top organizations, and in their growth and in what they have. Where does esports stand in terms of how big of an industry it is?
Sure. Well, if we're talking about dollars and let's say dollars in revenue,
Mhm.
in 2007, the conservative numbers were about 1.5 here in the United States, $1.5 billion in revenue in 2007. Um, in
Wow.
2020, the year we're about to close out, is projected to end for this year's revenue just in the United States. Let me see, it's $2.3 billion. So it's growing rapidly. The kind of surprising thing, outside the last 3 years, it's been growing organically as well. So it hasn't really been driven by large venture capitalist firms or significant investment by high net worth individuals or anything like that until the last 3 to 4 years, and then that's really accelerated things. But
Mhm.
before then, it was community driven. It was your typical fan coalescing with other fans to do something bigger, to run a giant LAN party and have a couple thousand people show up from around the region, around the country, or globally. I mean, that's what you were seeing, and a large chunk of it was driven through in-game monetization and sometimes sponsorships, but that was even small back then. Everything has
Mhm.
skyrocketed. The brands that are coming into the place, Visa, MasterCard, Buffalo Wild Wings, Cheetos. We just saw Ford just enter the space. Nike and
Mhm.
Adidas is entering the space, right? Um,
Mhm.
Rep to one of my partners. If you didn't see, that's an Adidas thing. But you're seeing these massive brands, right? They're coming in
Mhm.
because they're now one of two things. They're finally recognizing that, wow, that missing audience that they've been funneling advertising dollars to try to get a hold of, but with no success really. They figured out where that audience went, and they're trying to now interject their brand with that audience so that they can move their own needle in terms of sales and marketing, obviously, right? The
Mhm.
second component is the infrastructure, that is the production, the streaming, the event management, the team organizations. Uh, Around esports has professionalized to such a point that they can easily interject their brands on a national system, right? Before that, nothing was of scale, nothing was of size enough to match the level of investment they wanted to put in, or to reach
Hmm.
the marketing size they wanted without them needing to partner with many multiples of groups to hit the same types of numbers. If you're looking at just traditional television ad buying, right, within a few minutes you can go to a marketplace, figure out the exact demographic you want, the time of the year, the day, actually the time, the time of that day you want to get in front of that audience, and you can do it, right? It'll show, here's all these options across radio, across television, across the internet now as well. And if you click the button, you can spend your entire budget getting whatever campaign you have built out.
Yeah.
For esports, that didn't exist, and it's now starting to come out in its infancy to where now brands of those sizes can get involved and hit the
Hmm.
type of marketing numbers, the population numbers that they wanted, without basically having to build it themselves. That was the big thing. They didn't want to get in there and be um, unoriginal to the space, and try to build something that the audience that's living there would look at and go like, who the heck are you? Why are you trying to get involved
Hmm.
in something that's a passion of mine when I know that you have, as a company or as an individual, have no interest in the space? And that
Hmm.
still exists to today, but definitely there's been a seismic amount of growth in terms of the dollars being spent as well as the dollars being invested.
Hmm. And you said it, but major brands now, uh, Pepsi or whoever it may be, they're getting on board. And I think previously, maybe it didn't make sense, like you said, it didn't make sense for them to invest in something like this. Whereas now, just due to the exposure and the anticipated growth, that was going to be another question I had for you, is the plan for the growth over the next 5 to 10 years, percentage wise, because you look at some of these major sponsorships that are happening, but the ones that are coming, I think will be much bigger, and that will continue to allow for esports to grow the way that it needs to grow.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, if you just look at, the LCS, that's the League of Legends Championship Series. That's their
Mhm.
professional arm here in the United States. For Overwatch, you have the Overwatch League, OWL. Just look at what it costs to formally to buy a team in those, right? It would go back to 2006, 2007, couple $100,000, and you can have yourself one of the most premier teams playing in the LCS, right? And those back then, you'd have all these young guys, less so women, but they're there too. Basically living in a McMansion, all of them gaming, and that would be your
Yeah.
clubhouse, right? That'd be your team. That's all
Mhm.
gone away. When League of Legends came out, right, it was a buy-in of, in its first round in terms of its franchise league, it was $10 million, which was a lot of
Mhm.
money compared to where it came from. Um, and then if we looked at Overwatch, they came out at I think $20 million per franchise slot. Their next expansion was at $30 million per franchise slot. Um, it's grown, and that was in a year for Overwatch. So literally 1 year going from 20, next year 30 million.
Mhm.
It's just entirely exponential in terms of all the numbers you look at, and especially when you're trying to tap into that professional space. But that's where you're seeing the facilities being built, the investments being made. I want to point out the Philadelphia Fusion. Their new space was a $40 million investment, and the Overwatch League requires each and every one of its teams to have their own venue in their own home cities. That's another big evolutionary step for esports, to have not only your home team as opposed to every team being out of LA, but you have your own home
Mhm.
team with its own venue to build up its own fan base in each respective city.
Mhm. And let's not forget about the gamers. I mean, the gamers are the ones that uh, are really where the eyes are. I think everybody wants to watch certain people play these games and have success, whether those people are associated with a particular team or what have you. I'm curious. So, if you look at your organization or some of these organizations that exist in esports, what are some of these organizations that people may not be aware of or probably should be aware of, especially as it pertains to higher education?
Well, yeah. If you're just looking at the higher education space, because there's a number of organizations at the professional level. Most of them are run by the publishers. That is the company that owns the game. They produce the game, they distribute the game, they run the game.
Mm-hmm.
And even a little bit in the collegiate space, you'll still see that. So, for example, Riot, which owns League of Legends, which is, I would say, probably the biggest esports that exists for about the
Mm-hmm.
last 10 years. Um, they run something called CLOL, College League of Legends. Um, Blizzard, which owns Overwatch, they run tests through an organization they own called TESPA. They run a whole bunch of collegiate competitions in a bunch of their games, from Hearthstone to Overwatch, to StarCraft, and then a few others. Um, so those are two examples of organizations that are in actuality the publisher, the owner of the game. Outside of that, you have you have us, the National Association of Collegiate Esports. We're a little bit unique in the entire space because we're a nonprofit 501c3. We're the only org that's ran by our member institutions, and all of our member institutions are varsity programs. These are the official programs of the schools. It means they all have facilities on campus. They all have staff leading these programs. These students are recruited to come to campus, to come to the institution as a varsity esports athlete. Um, it's more similar to, when you turn on your TV and you see your football program or basketball or baseball, whatever sport you care for, and if you have an alma mater that you watch, it's more similar to that than it is to a club, right? A club is just
Mm-hmm.
something where students get together to play for fun. While I hope varsity sports is still fun, it is competitive, right? You are specifically at that institution not only to earn a degree but to win, and that's really about it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that's kind of the mix in the collegiate space. You have a few groups who kind of touch upon it. There's another one called Play Versus out of LA. This is the first time ever they ran a season of competition in Fortnite for colleges, and but most of what they do is in the high school space. Um, and that's roughly it. There were many more organizations, but the space is consolidated in the last 2 years pretty dramatically.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that was for the better, the consolidation?
But yeah, very much so, right? The publishers are always going to be here. They're active partners in the space because at the end of the day, it's their product, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Outside of that, though, you really are looking at what value do other groups provide to their users. In my case, it's our member institutions. I report at the end of the day to the presidents of those colleges, universities. Usually they
Mm-hmm.
delegate to whoever's their subject matter expert, but that's who I report to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's key for us, and it's a unique differentiator between us and anyone else in the space. But we saw a lot of groups that were spun up either by students who were just excited and want to organize something bigger in the collegiate space. And we also saw, private backed venture capital groups who try to come into the space. And
Mm-hmm.
most of them have failed out. And I think that's good because what we're talking about uniquely is there's going to be three groups in the college esports space that will never go away. It's going to be the publisher, because someone has to make the game and sell it. It's going to be the institution, because without the institution, there really is no college now, is there? And it's going to be the students. And those are going to be the three permanent groups in any discussion. Outside of that, the question becomes, what value do you provide to all or one of those groups to have a seat at the table? And I think what we saw is there was a lot of confusion, a lot of fracturing in the marketplace, because that differentiator wasn't clear. And it's, I think, dramatically become more clear as the space has become less contentious.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. I mean, anytime you bring clarity, I think that's for the better. I'm curious. So, our topic is tips for designing esports venues and training facilities. When I think esports, I think spectacle. I think, okay, yeah, I haven't participated, but I've seen videos online of them streaming these esports events, and I do think it is a spectacle very similar to how you would view a live sporting event. What types of facilities are you seeing people use, or whether, like we talked about the mansion earlier, but in terms of arenas, I believe there's only a handful of actual esports arenas here in the U.S. I'm sure there's many globally, but
Wow.
can you speak on that? And
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, it depends on how you define the word arena, right?
Okay.
I think when you use that word, people tend to think back to what they're familiar with, and they might think more of a basketball arena, right?
Mhm.
And in some instances, that is probably correct when you think about seating and the size of the space to a certain point, right? There is no dedicated esports facility that's going to fit 50,000 people, 40,000, 30,000, 10,000. I would say that's a huge stretch. What you're looking at is an in-person audience somewhere between 100 to maybe 2,000 people. They're more intimate, and that's because the viewership for the most part is online, and that viewership is massive. And that's where the monetization really occurs too. You're not really going to monetize to that great of level as of right now from your in-person audiences. All of that is actually to help you with your production stream so that you have the audience cheering on. You get the video reels, you get the sound effects, right? And that's all going into your online production because that's where 99.9% of your audience is going to be.
Mhm.
Um, so we do see those, and again, we're seeing more and more of those pop up every day in the United States. If you go a step below that, what you're really talking about is gaming cafes. And
Mhm.
those are not meant for spectators at all. That's meant for players, whether at the amateur or even semi professional level. And basically, you're seeing those grow every single day. I mean, there's got to be thousands of them in the US already. And that's probably just within the last 2 to 3 years. That is a space that's been targeted for investment by many different groups. And I would challenge you, any city you can think of, to just type in, Google esports cafe, gaming cafe. I would be shocked if there's less than three in your own city right now, and that's only growing.
Really? Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. There's a eBlue and Allied Esports. I think eBlue's records are building a new gaming cafe every 3 days in the United States.
Mhm. Wow.
Yeah, but again, smaller in size. It's more of a souped up computer lab that's being monetized. People are renting, a computer for X number of hours. It's a different customer. It's a different product they're offering than what you're familiar
Mhm.
with in terms of esports when you're thinking an esports arena or facility.
Mhm. When I think about athletics in higher education, how far, I'm curious, but how far are we away, you think, from colleges competing against one another, or divisions competing against one another, and you actually have X amount of teams per division that are a part of a conference? Or because as far as I know, that doesn't exist, or something like that doesn't exist currently. Maybe it does, but on a smaller scale. I'm more so thinking larger scale, where it's the Dallas esports team versus the LA esports team.
Um, well, in the collegiate level, it is happening already. So we have
Mhm.
athletic conferences who have basically interjected esports into their conference system. You have the Big Ten, that's a Power Five conference. They're involved in esports. The Big East, this is their second year with the ESL, where they're running their own esports competition. I think in Rocket League to be specific, but also in League of Legends. You've got the Mountain West Conference as well, and a bunch of D2 conferences, D3 conferences. So the conference market, that's actually been accelerating, and there's already some pretty pretty big conferences in the space.
Mhm.
Um, Now the question is breaking it up into divisions. Um, that would happen basically at this point if our membership wanted that to occur, which we're not there yet, right? When we look at
Mhm.
divisions in traditional athletics, the differentiator primarily is the number of scholarships you offer per sport, right? The higher up in division you go, the more scholarships there are available for those team members, the students on those various teams.
Mhm.
That's the key difference. And so, we usually think Division One larger schools. That's not necessarily true. I mean, like, let's think of the Big 12. You have the University of Kansas. You have Kansas State University. You're looking at enrollment size. sizes, 5,000 to 40,000 on campus. But then in the same conference, you got TCU, which I think is like 12,000 students on campus, but they compete at the same division. So what's the difference? Well, it's the amount of money they make available into their athletics department as well as the students within there. We don't know in esports if that same formula works at all because it's much smaller team sizes. Um,
Mhm.
and when we look competitively, we don't see a clear difference yet between scholarships offered and the skill and ability of those teams. It's really right now, it looks like any school can beat any school most days. And so until we develop the right characteristics that clearly denotes, maybe you're at a different level than your fellow institutions. Um, it's going to be a struggle for us to clearly define and break out divisions. But I have no doubt that will eventually occur. You're going to see institutions in the esports space for different reasons, and therefore their investments in the space will be different. And we'll see a split between that to retain some level of competitive equity, as
Mhm.
hopefully as much as we can.
Understand. So it sounds like the competitive landscape then still needs to somewhat be defined, and that could potentially dictate who does what with each particular institution.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, it'll we're a membership association. If that was to come through, basically you're going to see our institutions wanting to see a split in competition along whatever characteristic, and then they vote on it, and then you'll have divisions. But until then, everyone's competing against everyone. You've got the small schools competing against the largest institutions in the country and Canada as well. So national borders here in North America don't really matter so much when it comes to collegiate esports. But it's really a toss up on who's going to win any match. It's exciting in that way too.
And that's something I was going to speak to. I mean, the excitement. Why do we get so excited about sports? It's the unknown. I mean, we don't know when that pitch is thrown, what's going to happen. That's why we tune in and we like to watch sports live.
Hmm.
When I think about uh, esports, it's the same thing, right?
Very much so, especially at the collegiate level. The level of competition across the board is a very high level. Um, and because of that, you don't really know who's going to win. You don't know the outcome. That drives the excitement. But what we're
Hmm.
hoping to see is an evolution of that, where people are watching and tuning in because of an affinity to their alma mater, and it's an activity that they have a personal interest in too. So
Hmm.
it's the local audiences that at the end of the day will carry the majority of the weight when it comes to esports being in the same atmosphere, the same conversation as the NFL or the MLB, right? If we want it to be there, it's the local grassroots audiences that carry the majority of that weight.
It's the fans. I mean,
Yep.
what are you without the fans? In my eyes, no matter what sport you are or organization in general. I do think though that coming back to what we were just discussing, it's exciting that because like I said, with sports, I'm attracted to the competitiveness. So I tune in, I may not watch a baseball game all year long, but I'm going to watch the playoffs
Well,
and I'm going
nobody's
to watch
watching
the World.
baseball right now, unfortunately.
I know,
It's
right?
killing me.
Yeah. No one's watching anything right now. But I think the excitement around sports and that competitiveness, that's why people tune in. However, if you look at collegiate sports, there is an issue with certain teams in certain conferences. Let's just say certain colleges, universities competing with each other, and the level of competitiveness just isn't there. I mean, the football games are 54 to nothing, and it's like, why are they playing each other? And coming back to what you were speaking to earlier, I mean, it's obvious what team's going to win there. Why are we watching it? And I think coming back to it, you probably don't see as many people tuning in to the games that everybody knows who's going to win versus the games where I have no idea who's going to win this game. This makes sense for me to watch. The national championship, bowl games, things of that nature. You just don't know who's going to win. Uh, with esports, I know there are the people that play these games, Overwatch, what have you, that are a level above everybody else. Someone told me something a while ago about the Red Baron, how the Red Baron shot down so many more fighter planes than everybody else. There was just this level of difference between the Red Baron and everybody else, and I think you have that not just in sports, but in esports and gaming. You have some of these gamers that are a notch above everybody else. How is esports addressing that when you have somebody or a group of individuals that is so far ahead of everybody else competitively that they're whatever game it is, there's not going to be a chance for them to win. Now, maybe if it's team based, something like that, but I mean,
Yeah.
Fortnite, Battle Royale, in some cases it's 1 versus 150, 200 versus 3 versus however many. Can you speak on that?
So you're, if I understand the question, you're asking how do we, if I was in another team or anything, how do we beat LeBron James of esports? That's what
Pretty
you're
much.
asking,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, right? Yeah, because
The
well, coming
answer is if it's LeBron James, you throw everyone you got at him.
yes,
Look,
yes.
there's a
Team-based.
if
Yeah.
it's team based, yes, one person can carry a significant amount of the game because the team sizes we're talking about, 5 player, 6 player per team. One person can make a significant difference. It's not like football to where no matter how great of a running back you are, that doesn't matter because there's enough people on the other side that it kind of balances out, right? So strategy becomes a huge part. Physical dominance is still there, right? But when you're talking at that level, everyone's amazing. So, right, we see that in esports too. So really, you're talking about strategy. That's why we have
Mhm.
coaches in the space because coaches do make a sizable difference. And when you're at that level, right, every inch matters. Um,
Mhm.
of course, we're talking esports, so the inch we're talking about is digital. It's not a real inch, but it's there,
I
right? It's that skill difference. Um, so
and
a lot of it's strategy, a lot of it is scouting your opposing team, knowing what they're doing. There's a lot of technology around that, eye tracking technology, stuff. That's actually going through the data points and measuring. In a certain situation, this person is more likely to do this. So what's your response? Well, that's where
yes.
strategy comes in place. Practice and competition, ranking's a big thing, so we know what level your natural skill is and what we can do to refine that. Um, so it's very similar to traditional athletics. That question you ask, it's no different than what you'd ask in traditional athletics compared to what you would ask in esports. You do the exact
Mhm.
same type of things to counter a superstar where it's possible. Um, you know,
Yeah,
but
throw yeah,
that's
everything
exactly
but
where
the
we are.
kitchen sink. Yeah.
Yeah.
I gotcha. And you said it. In my eyes, it's the physical dominance versus virtual dominance, right? Because in
Oh yeah.
some cases, it's an avatar or someone I can't even see. LeBron James physically is 6'8", 275 pounds. He's going to dominate the game of basketball more often than not. Whereas somebody playing a game, it's virtual dominance, right? It's
Yep.
their ability to do things with their hands or do things with a controller that other people just cannot do. And that's what's
Or doing it in ways that you didn't even think to do, right? That's a big thing.
mhm,
That's where, in StarCraft, Brood Wars, which was, I'd say one of the first televised season wide esports out there, right? Really blew up in Korea. This was like plus 10 years ago when it was on television, and huge arenas were being sold out for this. But
mhm,
their tracking on a professional athlete was 200 actions per minute. Um, so basically, that player to be considered just on their analog ability, their ability to enter commands through a keyboard and a mouse, would input 200 commands per minute, and those commands would be important and influential in the output, the impact that it has in the game. So they're not just frivolous. I'm moving left and right 200 times. No, anyone can do
mhm,
that. Well, maybe not anyone, but you can give it a shot. It's 200 actions that actually had an influence on the outcome of the entire match and were strategic. Now think about you or me or any other normal person thinking 200 steps in a minute and actually executing all 200 of those steps in a minute. It's incredible. The way that a high level gamer processes information visually is very different than us, right? When we look at a game, we typically are looking at where the action is occurring. What we know from professional gamers is they're rarely looking at that. They're looking at all the other information flows around them. They don't need to look at what's happening on the screen necessarily in terms of all the graphics, the cool lights, and attacks and all that. They already know that. Now they're planning their next step and the next step over that and the next step over that, right? it's a totally different way of processing the game that a typical fan wouldn't process the same information they're seeing.
Anybody can pick up a controller
Yeah,
and play a game, but some of the things you see in esports, what they're able to do, it really is mind blowing. Because I played some of these games and to see what they do, that brings it. That's real perspective right there. It's like I have no idea how he did that, but like you said, his brain, it's firing on different cylinders. Well, we've got a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that we spend some time speaking to the topic, critical design elements for esports arenas. But one thing I want to speak to before we jump into that, if you look at gaming, gaming has been the same way uh, for a very long time. And what I mean by that is, like other industries, technology has evolved. Therefore, industries have evolved. But if you look at gaming, specifically console gaming, it's really been the same for a very long time now. Are consoles better, faster than they ever have been? Yes. Are the graphics of these games much improved? Yes. You can speak to all of those things, but fundamentally, foundationally, gaming is really still the same. So I'm curious, um, when you speak to or think about the evolution of gaming, virtual reality, augmented reality, how will that impact esports? What kinds of conversations are taking place around this topic?
sure. Well, I'll say it's actually surprisingly it's in reverse, right? We see
Hmm.
esports impacting traditional athletics and the presentation of traditional athletics much more than we're seeing it the other way around. And I'll give you an example that you can turn on your well, if the NBA was going on right now, right, you could watch it and you see what I mean. So
Hmm.
those green and blue circles under the players when they do a freeze screen, they pull up the stats, right, and so you see by the circle underneath the player's feet which player we're talking about. Their little stat sheet pops up above their head. That is
Hmm.
taken from gaming. That's taken from NBA 2K. That's taken from games even before that, right? That exact situation you're watching on television with real players. Yes, they're being filmed and you're watching it via television, but that feature comes entirely from gaming. um,
Historically, yeah, that's
yeah,
interesting.
so we see that impact, and now we're seeing it a little bit with AR, especially. Right, virtual reality, not so much. It doesn't exist in gaming for the most part, except for kind of indie development. Right, you've got the Vive, you've got I think it's Google Lens, right? A bunch of other things that, yeah, there are some games in the VR, but there's not a lot of them. They're not heavily developed yet. I think Valve just released, I believe it's called Alexis, which is probably one of the most, you know, actual games that are out there with a kind of a storyline and progression sequence, and it's not more like an arcade game. There's a kind of a difference there. Um, so we are seeing it advance, but when it comes to esports, virtual reality is not part of the conversation yet. I think you have a few issues there. One, the equipment's quite expensive for the individual user, and if we're talking about democratizing the equipment so that you build up that national grassroots fan base, you allow them to coalesce around games that are skill based that they like to compete in. We're not there yet. We're still trying to get to the point of introducing the technology to people who can afford it. I think the Vive is a couple $1,000s. If you think for a kid, that's a my parents would have told me no. First off, right? They're not going to spend that much for a gaming platform. I got lucky that uncle loved me enough to buy my first console, and I think that
Hmm.
was a couple $100s way back in the day.
Yeah,
Um,
likewise.
so yeah, that would not have come from my parents, but that's the issue we're seeing right now. So we're still early days in terms of esports when we're talking about the subject of VR. AR though is it's interesting. So we're seeing a combination in kind of a few startups of esports. So you're actually playing in person, right? And I forgot the name of the game, but basically it's a team based game. It's kind of like tennis, except for there is no tennis court, there are no paddles, um, there's no tennis rackets, there's no ball. That's all AR. So you see what you're playing on, but you also see overlays of there's the net, your hand is now the racket, and you're playing that way. And if you didn't have an AR setup and you saw people doing that, you think that they've lost their minds, right? Because
Mhm.
they're going around this imaginary parking lot or whatever, and they're playing with that. That exists, and that's amazing. Also, going back to the NBA as another example, and I say the NBA does a lot in forward thinking and testing out new technologies, more so than most other organizations I'm familiar with. But they've also, through your phone, and I've got my this is an iPhone, but this is my personal phone, right?
Mhm.
They've implemented last season technology so that you can hold up your camera, and there's an app that they release, right? And you in real time can follow with your camera any action that's going on in the court. And as it's
Mhm.
doing so, you can select any player as they're moving, and it'll bring up their box chart, it'll bring up their stats, right? You can do comparisons in real time as you're watching the game that you're in person, right? But through the
Mhm.
camera lens of your phone. That's incredible. That's brand new technology, and we're seeing more and more of that develop. So again, it's this weird function to where a lot of games in the esports genre are kind of a digital recreation of the traditional sport, right? Madden is a great example. NBA 2K is a great example of that. Rocket League, right, is soccer but with cars. You see a
Mhm.
lot of those interests coming across, and that's great. But the unique innovations in the esports space are now going back to where the original concepts came from and influencing
Mhm.
their traditional analogs, which is incredible.
Mhm.
Um, so you were going to ask about design elements of an esports arena, right? And I wanted to
Ye-
make sure.
To
Um,
finish the conversation, what would be your best advice for the people who are listening or are going to watch this? If they were considering designing, whether it's an arena, a lab, a training facility, what have you, what are the key things that they should be aware of, perhaps mistakes to avoid around the considerations for esports?
Right. Your main considerations are really who's the intended audience. If your
Mhm.
audience is spectators, online viewership, great, fantastic. You're mainly focusing on a production stage, which looks very similar to what you know in television, right? With your ESPN Sports Center desks, right? Very, very,
Mhm.
very similar. If you want some in-person audience, the question is how much. I will tell you that almost no esports organization monetizes successfully an in-person audience. It's just not normal to the population, the
Mhm.
gamers, the fans. That's not how they're used to engaging with esports. They're used to watching through Twitch or YouTube, and that's how they prefer to watch and engage with the content. So very few organizations try that, but they do allow their enthusiasts, some seating. It's usually a couple hundred. It's not much more than that. Some places have gone a little bit higher than that, and that is, again, is just to add to the production value that they're pushing out online, and that's where they're really monetizing. But that's for the competitive spaces. If you're thinking purely, who do I want? I want gamers, right? I don't want fans are great and everything, but I want gamers, people there to play. Then you're talking more about a gaming cafe, in which case you're basically trying to maximize the floor space, whatever floor space you have, with the greatest number of computers in there to act as gaming stations, so you can maximize space. In that industry, it functions a lot more like a gym, right? A gym membership. That's primarily what it's mirrored off of a club of an athletics club, right? Where
Mhm.
instead of those subjects, we're talking about gaming now. So trying to get people to get monthly memberships and then come and visit and play. You're having organized competition, many tournaments you're running to keep people engaged and excited. But that model is there as well. At the highest level, you're talking about something like the Philadelphia Fusion. I know Houston is building another facility as well. A few other cities, which I'm not too sure if they've announced yet. All right, but that is built primarily for those professional teams in the Overwatch League or the LCS. Those are going to be in the U.S. The two leagues we're talking about.
Mhm.
And you're then thinking it's not only a stadium, but it's a practice facility, it's a player lounge area, it's merchandising to an extent, and offices, right? You're trying to basically fit everything you need to run an organization in one building. Um, for the Philadelphia Fusion, it's an incredibly nice building, by the way.
Hmm.
But it's interesting. Instead of having your administration separate from your players, they're basically in the same space, but different sections of the space are maximized for the use of a designated group, even within the same organization, um, with the most of it being outsized to the stadium. That is to say, the stage, the displays there, the shoutcaster analyst studio, and then some for spectator seating. The last thing I'll say on this is, um, I think this is my prediction, but if you're looking at an esports arena or facility, the best bet you can make to maximize your likelihood of success is to make sure it's a flexible space. So that one week it's for an esports competition, and then next week maybe it's for some sort of concert, right?
Hmm.
Maybe it's a TED talk, right? Keep the space flexible so it's not just locked in for just esports or just anything else, right? You want to maximize flexibility because you're going to have off seasons, you're going to have bye weeks, right? You're going to want to
Pandemics.
keep, yeah, pandemics, right? Well, pandemics hasn't slowed esports down at all. We've actually only accelerated because
Hmm.
we can still compete remotely online while unfortunately nothing else is.
Hmm.
Um, Nobody likes to say like, oh yeah, the pandemic was great for us, right? But for esports, unfortunately, we can say like it's been the greatest thing in the last few years that's happened to esports because it's everywhere right now because it's the only thing that's able to keep going on really undisturbed. Um,
And that,
and
yeah, I'm with you. That's what
that's
I was speaking to. Go ahead.
yeah. Again, still weird to say like, yes, the pandemic helped esports along,
Well,
but esports was already growing at an exponential rate. I mean, it was like a
yes.
rocket ship. So now it's the only rocket ship out there right now. And that's why it has some more eyeballs on it. Um,
Yeah,
but
that
yeah,
earlier,
it's
I saw some statistics that said the viewership has grown significantly, upwards of 10, 20% on the various platforms. Whereas I was referring to the arena,
yeah.
esports arena world is impacted by pandemic. But if you actually create spaces, by spaces I mean where people are going to come to, a pandemic could
Oh yeah.
impact
Yes,
that.
you're absolutely right in that. And look, we all want to get back to normal. I'm still
Hmm.
under shelter in place order in my city. Um,
Hmm.
and I don't know when that's going to be lifted. I'm assuming one of my neighbors will eventually go, "Whatever happened to Michael?" and maybe let me know. But yeah, it's going to have an impact, and I think it will shift the way that we design facilities and the way we stage them as well. Uh, I
Hmm.
don't I don't think we're ever going to get back to a full sense of normalcy, at least not in the interim future. Hopefully, I hope we do.
Hmm.
But the concerns there are so serious. Concerns of until a vaccine comes out, a second wave, that's going to have an impact on everyone in the collegiate space. That's what our member institutions are battling with right now. Is when will it be all right to have a normal semester with students on campus and filling out classrooms again? That same problem is being reflected on the entertainment side with concerts, with arenas, um, and that's going to require some difference, some different practices. But again, that's kind of where esports shine, is because almost the entirety of your audience was never going to be there in person anyways. They're going to be there online, and that almost the entire purpose of that venue is just to create a higher production value that you're providing to your audience online. So
Hmm.
again, esports is able to continue at an accelerated rate. It's perfectly situated for people who are working and living remotely, and it still offers an opportunity for communities to come together and coalesce around something that they're passionate about.
Michael, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure everybody is going to find a tremendous amount of value when it comes to esports and listening to someone like you speak about it.